40 million. 40 million. That is a very big number. 40 million is more than the population of California, of Canada, of Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania combined, of Sweden, Holland, and Belgium combined. 40 million. 40 million represents the number, and it may be more, of casualties in the First World War. Now, World War I casualties, half of those deaths and casualties were civilian. And of the other half, more than half, 10 to 11 million military deaths, only 2/3 were in battle. And what's significant about that is the things we take for granted today, inoculations, preventatives, cures, did not exist. Typhus fever, for example, not related to typhoid, different disease entirely. Typhus fever had a mortality rate of up to 80%. A disease you've never heard of, trench foot. Trench foot. These troops are in trenches, and it rains, and there's no place for the water to drain. You have soldiers standing literally for days, huddled in trenches in ankle-deep water that their makeshift latrines are running into. Trench foot would occur when this kind of condition existed and your feet were wet for a continual period of time. It would result in gangrene, which would result in the amputation of your leg. Malaria, and then Spanish fever, or Spanish flu, excuse me, what a misnomer. Spanish flu began, the first recorded case was it in March of 1918 at Camp Funston in Kansas. It quickly spread to other troops, and by April of 1918, a month later, troops in Germany, France, Britain, Canada, and the United States all had Spanish flu. Now, during the First World War, all of the news was being censored by the belligerent countries. The Germans weren't about to say, my God, half our guys are really sick, and put it in the newspaper, because they think, well, the British will attack us, thinking that half our guys aren't even around. Well, guess what? The British had the same problem, and they weren't saying it. Neither were the French, neither were the Americans. It was not until the end of the war, Spain was not a belligerent, so it published the news. It was not until the end of the war that Spain found out that they weren't the only ones that had it. Eventually, Spanish flu infected 1/3 of the world's population, and between 50 and 100 million people perished from it. Another 6 million were missing. The United States entered the war on 6 April 1917. And we committed less than 5 million men and women. We had 1 million troops on the ground in the trenches by the middle of 1918. Of that million, 120,000 were killed in action, more than 200,000 were wounded in action, and this doesn't include those who got diseases. So if you were one of the troops, one of the boots on the ground, if you will, your chances of getting home the way you left, if you got home at all, weren't real great. Now, on 11 November 1918, at 5 a.m., at the request of Germany, an armistice was being signed in a rail car a little outside of Paris in a forest. Germany had requested the armistice. The war had not touched Germany. All of the war was being fought in France and Belgium. But Germany realizes we're beat. were licked. And they requested an armistice. What is an armistice? That's a ceasefire. This was a ceasefire in name only. It was an abject surrender on the part of the Germans. And by 5:45 in the morning, the signing was completed. And everybody got up and said, we'll notify everyone that the war is over and they can stop fighting. General Ferdinand Foch, French general, was a supreme Allied commander, and he had other thoughts. He viewed himself as a poetic romantic. And he said, no, we're not stopping the war yet. We're going to stop it at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Such nice symmetry. Well, commanders on both sides, they weren't so poetic or romantic. They said, guys, stand down. Just don't do anything crazy, okay? The war's over. Got a few hours and so on to wait. But a few did otherwise. Some of the American commanders particularly had only been at the front for a few months. This is their last shot at glory. We're going to go, we're going to overrun a German position. We're going to get this. We're going to make ourselves heroes. Which brings me to the tragic story of a very interesting guy, Henry Nicholas John Gunther. Henry Gunther was a German-American. He lived in Germantown area of Baltimore. Germantown, like many or not most of the Northeast cities at that time, and even today, have areas of the city that are ethnic enclaves, if you will. Little Italy, Chinatown, Germantown in Baltimore in this case. And as we have, as a country, frequently done with minorities or ethnic groups, they were looked down on. Germantown wasn't a great place to say you were from. Well, Henry Gunther had just gotten a job out of Germantown. He was a first-generation American. His parents were immigrants from Germany. And he had gotten a job at the First National Bank of Baltimore, and he had gotten engaged to a lovely young woman. His whole life was ahead of him. And he got drafted. And he said, I'm an American first, not a German American. And so he trained, and he went off to the front. He got a letter in October of 1918 from his cousin in Germantown who was thinking of enlisting. And he wrote him back and he said, don't do it. If you're drafted, go and do your duty. But don't enlist. You have no idea how terrible it is here. You may very well die before you ever see action. The conditions are deplorable. His letter happened to have been chosen for censorship. And within 48 hours, he was stripped of his rank. He had been promoted from private to private first class to corporal to sergeant. He had been doing great. He was an exemplary soldier, and now he's stripped of his rank. Word got back to Baltimore. He lost his job. He had no job to go back to. In humiliation, his fiancée broke off the engagement. We're talking about devastation of the First Order. And they sent him right to the front. And so it was that Private Henry Gunther of the 79th Infantry Division's 313th Infantry Regiment went over the top on the morning of 11 November 1918. He ran toward a German roadblock, and he was the only one running there. The Germans stood up in this fortification, stood up without arms, waving. One guy spoke broken English and said, war over, stop, war over. But still he came on. He was American. He was doing his duty. And finally, at the last moment, they opened fire and cut him down with machine gun fire at 10:59 a.m. 1 minute before the ceasefire. Henry Nicholas John Gunther was the last soldier killed in the First World War, and he was a German American. As he laid in a field in France under a cross, he was decorated with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, as well as a French Legion of Merit. He was also restored to his previous rank of Sergeant +1. At his family's request, his body was exhumed and sent back to Baltimore. That's his marker, which you can see today in Baltimore, in Germantown. Between 5:45 and 11 a.m., there were 3,000 more killed, 11,000 more casualties. Poetic, romantic, indeed. So many military deaths, which brings me to John McCrae. John McCrae is a very interesting fellow. He was the chief surgeon of the Canadian Army, which of course was part of the British Army, part of the Commonwealth, and so on. While in college, he had a great interest in the military. He was trained as an artillery officer. And in fact, he fought in South Africa in 1899. But he came back and went to medical school. And he became very skilled as a surgeon. And interestingly, in the ensuing years, he became so respected that he became the chief surgeon not only at Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, but also at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Very skilled. When the war broke out, he enlisted at age 41 and he was made chief surgeon of the Canadian Army. At the Second Battle of Ypres in April and May of 1915, there was incredible carnage, and he was walking on the field among the dead and dying, trying to comfort the dying, and in some cases having wounded moved back to a makeshift surgical tent not too far away to assist with surgery, to try to save some of these people. And as he's doing this, he came upon his best friend, a lifelong friend of his, lying dead in the field. A field in Belgium. This prompted him and inspired him to write a poem entitled In Flanders Fields. It became emblematic of the First World War, and still is. Just a couple verses. In Flanders Field, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. The poppy became a symbol of the First World War. I'm wearing a poppy pin right here. That's not a button here. That's a little poppy pin a lady in England gave me during an event over there. It symbolizes the black, the death of those who died in service. The red, the blood and sacrifice of all of those affected by the war. And the green of the leaves and the stem represent renewal, hope for the future following the war. If you go to a World War I cemetery in France or in England today, everyone has poppies. Veterans Day began as Armistice Day, began 1 year following the end of the First World War. And we celebrated it here in the United States informally. Congress authorized observance in the mid-20s, and in 1938, it became a national holiday, suspended during the Second World War. President Eisenhower in 1954, in order to honor both the First World War, but also the Second World War and Korean War veterans, changed the name to Veterans Day. Congress changed it in '68 to the fourth Monday. Some of us remember that. It was the case for 7 years, and then President Ford changed it back to where it resides today, the 11th. It's one of 3 holidays, along with Armed Forces Day, excuse me, and Memorial Day, that honor our veterans. What is Veterans Day? Well, we celebrate it as a holiday. And on Veterans Day, 3 things are certain. First, there are big sales. Second, Great Clips will give free haircuts to veterans. And third, Mike Lindell will still sell you a pillow. Now, if you don't need a pillow, you need to call the Medicare hotline at 1-800-690-U812 and get all the benefits you deserve. And if you don't need any benefits, just remember that Liberty Mutual customizes your car insurance so you only pay for what you need. Although, Flo might disagree with that. We celebrate it as a holiday, and we say, Happy Veterans Day. I am not here to wish you a happy Veterans Day. Veterans Day properly is a day to honor and commemorate all those who have served, past and present. And who are these that we honor today, or honor in 2 days? Well, they're the Minutemen of Concord Green and the War of 1812. They're the men in blue and the men in gray. They are the Rough Riders of San Juan Hill. They're the doughboys of the First World War, the soldiers, the airmen, the sailors of the Second World War. They are those men and women who served in Korea and Vietnam, in the Desert Wars and Gulf Wars. And they're also women. These are women, Catholic nuns who were nurses with General John J. Pershing, our top officer in the First World War. They're Rosie the Riveter. They're also the women who served overseas during the Second World War and the women who test flew and delivered the aircraft that the 8th Air Force and other combat aircraft flew. Women that served near the front in Korea and Vietnam. And they are the women who today, and for some years, have served with men overseas and around the world. All of them are veterans. And many are in here today with us. Veterans are needed because wars happen. War is ugly, but it's toppled dictators, terrorists, and it's eliminated genocide, liberated slaves, and by the way, guaranteed our freedom, including our own. Now, not everybody fought, but every veteran went through the unbridled joy of basic training. Which brings me to a book. We Were Soldiers Once and Young, written in 1992 by retired Lieutenant General Harold G. Moore and acclaimed journalist Joseph Galloway. It's a story of the Battle of Ia Drang, which was the first large-scale set-piece battle in Vietnam between the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army. Ironically, it began on 11 November 1965 and lasted for 1 week. This is a picture of then Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore in Vietnam, and this is a picture at a reunion in West Point in 2010. He was the West Point class of 1945. And he was, of course, retired at this point. This is a picture of Joseph Galloway, who was also at that reunion. And Joseph Galloway is very, very, very rare. He served most of his career in journalism with United Press International. He is one of the extremely rare civilians to have been awarded a military decoration. Here's why. He was embedded with Colonel Moore's unit. And as a medevac helicopter, as a rescue helicopter to take out wounded, a medevac helicopter is incoming to pick up wounded. He noticed a soldier out in the field crawling, trying to get back, but too badly wounded. He put down his camera and got up, and he ran out under fire, picked up the guy as the helicopter is landing, carried him to the helicopter, and put him in it. He was awarded a Bronze Star for that, as well he should have been. This guy is a stud. This is Basil Plumley. He was the right-hand man of Colonel Moore. He was a sergeant, and when he retired, he was command sergeant of the Army, for real this time, and he was pretty amazing. He was airborne qualified in World War II and volunteered, as we heard earlier. He volunteered to go in with the gliders on the Cotton Peninsula on D-Day. Extremely dangerous because we lost more than half of our gliders. And he also volunteered to go with gliders for Operation Market Garden, which was Montgomery's failed effort to get behind the bad guys and break through. He also served in Korea as an airborne sergeant and made jumps. He also served in Vietnam. This guy has quite a resume. This is a picture of them together in Vietnam and at that same reunion. The reunions that we have at West Point typically last 4 days, 3 nights. And that's why they're wearing different things right now, probably a different day. He came as General Moore's guest because he, of course, did not go to West Point. Basil Plumley in the movie of 2002 movie, We Were Soldiers, which was based on the book, was played by Sam Elliott. Now, those of you who don't know this about Sam Elliott, I have to tell you, he does a ton of pro bono work for the military. And by the way, this is a picture of him at the 2016 reunion that I was at. It was my 50th reunion at the Academy. That's a picture of me with him. You see the Go Army there. And by the way, beat Navy. He told a number of interesting stories, some of which I cannot share in a mixed audience, okay? But one of the things I will tell you he did, unlike most of the people most of the guests at our reunions, and unlike, for example, Ken Burns, who flies in, gives his little talk, and then flies out, Sam Elliott comes on day 1 of the reunion, and he stays for the whole thing. And you may be sitting next to him in the auditorium, listening to someone. You might be having lunch with him. He's a regular guy, I can tell you that. He told a couple stories, quick ones I'll share with you. The first one is, many of you are aware that suspect, I should say, that some Hollywood actors are vertically challenged. Looking at you, Tom Cruise. In this movie, We Were Soldiers, which 2002, Mel Gibson played Colonel Moore. And he said, I assure you that any scene that you see me talking face to face with Colonel Moore, there was a very large box involved, okay? Second thing he said was, they brought the actors down to Fort Benning here in Georgia, where much of the training for the Army goes on. And they invited the actors to go through one of the obstacle courses. Some of you have been through this obstacle course. And let me describe it to you. Picture, if you will, a berm, maybe a little bit taller than the ceiling here, kind of at an angle, highly compacted dirt. And then starting here at the foot of the berm, there's a field. Picture dirt, picture rocks, picture mud. And it goes for about 40 or 50 yards. And then ahead, you're going to come up to the end and then get out. Oh, and above you, about 22 inches above you, is stretched very sharp barbed wire. So you're not standing up. You're crawling, and you are keeping your rifle dry. Oh, and by the way, there's machine guns firing ahead of you. They're firing blanks because they invited the actors to go ahead and give this a try. And so some of the actors chose to do it. Some of the actors said, I'll take a powder on this. Sam Elliott did it. And he said, and I will use forgive me for using this expression, but he said, when you get close to those machine guns, even though we knew they were firing blanks, you have a real come to Jesus moment. Finally, they get through, and they get out, and the commanding officer said, well done, guys, those that did it. And he said, would you like to see our guys do it? And they said, well, sure, yeah, we did it. I guess they can do it. So they're standing up there, and they noticed the troops starting to go through it. And they're watching them, and then all of a sudden somebody noticed, remember that berm back here? Huge plumes of dirt and dust are flying. They're firing live ammunition now. And he said certain actors needed to change their underwear after that exercise. Veterans put their lives on hold to serve the country. And they asked their families to share that sacrifice. Everyone lived a military life. But some were on the front lines. Every veteran had a family or loved one that they would have given anything to be home with. And men weren't the only heroes. Some women served. Other women served with heartbreaking tasks. And so often it was the military wife at home, the Vietnam veteran's wife, or whatever, my mother. Three million veterans so far have served in the War on Terror. 5.5 million in the Gulf Wars, 7 million in Vietnam, less than 2 million in Korea, 16 million in the Second World War, and we are rapidly losing so many. Veterans endured separations, diseases, bad conditions, and families suffered a child's pain. Mama, where's Daddy? He doesn't ever come home anymore. Daddy, why come Mama doesn't come home anymore? 1 of 10, less than, American adults is a veteran. It is an elite group. Veterans are proud to have served. Presidents, including Washington and Eisenhower, were more proud of their office than they were, of their service than they were of their office. And if you doubt this, read the obits, and you will see the service is prominently mentioned. Compare the responsibilities. On the one hand, a profit and loss sheet, and on the other hand, the lives of the men and women you serve with. And let us not forget those who have died in service. As we so well know, this is a picture of 26,000 flags at the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force on Memorial Day, to remind us all when we think of the 8th Air Force. During World War II, there were 16 numbered air forces, 16, scattered around the world. Half of the deaths in the Second World War suffered by the Army Air Force were suffered by the 8th Air Force. The other 15 air forces had the other half of the deaths. Put another way, those 26,000 plus deaths in the 8th Air Force is greater by more than 25% than the entire Marine Corps suffered in World War II. The 8th Air Force paid their dues. Abraham Lincoln said, "Let us not forget they gave the last full measure of devotion." Christian, Jew, Muslim, buried next to each other, Americans. And let us not forget the Gold Star families, those who have lost a family member in service. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. 1,360,000 servicemen and women have given their lives for their country. We have freedom, as FDR said, because men died for it. The veterans were ready, willing, and able to give their all, and so many did, to preserve the freedom that Ronald Reagan reminded us is never more than one generation away from distinction. In 1963, an American poet wrote a poem entitled, "Doesn't Anybody Know My Name?" He set it to music, and he sang it. It became almost an anthem for the Vietnam War in the mid-60s. Doesn't anybody know my name? At one time, there were 8 or 10 different artists actually recorded it. At one time, Doesn't Anybody Know My Name was both number 1 and number 2 on the top 40 with 2 different artists. You can Google it. You can hear it on online very easily. I've listened to a bunch of different versions. Personally, I like Rod McCune's the best, but you can make your own choice. I assure you, I am not going to sing. But to conclude, I'm going to recite a couple verses because they really fit. I've been away so long, fought a war that's come and gone. Doesn't anybody know my name? Fought that war across the sea, almost died to keep us free. Doesn't anybody know my name? Please tell me, if you can, what time do the trains roll in? 2:10, 6:18, 10:44. Doesn't anybody know my name? We do know your name. Veteran. Because we know that heroes don't wear capes. They wear dog tags. That is all.